Уважаемые дамы и господа, мы начинаем сессию «Российско-американские отношения. Есть ли шанс снижения напряженности?» Dear ladies and gentlemen, we're starting panel discussion US-Russia relations. any chances for de-escalation? На сцену приглашаются модератор, заместитель министра иностранных дел Российской Федерации Сергей Рябков. Спикеры. Главный научный сотрудник Совета по международным отношениям Томас Грэм. Научный руководитель Института США и Канады РАН, академик, профессор Сергей Рогов. Ведущий научный сотрудник Центра морского военно-морского анализа в Арлингтоне Майкл Кофман. Профессор политологии в Бернард-колледже Колумбийского университета и директор Института Гарримана по изучению России, Евразии и Восточной Европы Александр Кули. Руководитель Центра североамериканских исследований ММО имени Примакова РАН Виктория Журавлева. Президент Итальянского общества международных организаций Франко Фраттини. Please welcome on the stage moderator, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation Sergei Ryabkov, Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations Thomas Graham, Academic Director of the Institute for US and Canadian Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences, full member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Professor Sergei Rogov, Senior Research Scientist at the Center for Naval Analysis in Arlington, Michael Kaufman, Claire Tsao Professor of Political Science at Barnard College and Director of the Harriman Institute for the Study of Russia, Eurasia and Eastern Europe, Alexander Cooley, Head of the Center for North American Studies of the Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations, Victoria Zhuravleva, President of the Italian Society for International Organization, Franco Frattini.
And so we have online, I am Sergei Rябkov, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I was happy to accept the invitation of the organizers of Primakov readings that are being resumed offline. So I was asked to moderate this section with an element of provocativeness, so has been referred to as U.S.-Russia relations, any chances for de-escalation. That's a certain tint of provocation. So the panel has been introduced. I will just say a few words about each of the panelists as we proceed, but by way of an introductory comment, I'd like to identify 3 points. First point, in a week's time in Geneva, there is going to be a summit of the presidents of Russia and the United States. A lot of expectations are connected with it. It is true that this is a very important event. Extremely important event, and this event, as we all hope, will bring about many answers to many questions. And I have no personal answer to the question whether after this contact between the leaders will be able to maintain a sustainable trend for the normalization and stabilization of our relations. But the Russian side is striving for that. And this is the essence of the tasks that we're trying to address. And we appeal to the administration of Biden to be as responsible, as energetic, as dynamic to get involved to address this issue. And we need to realize that the time is speeding up, especially at the modern stage of the development of the relationship is much faster than it used to be, and was speeding up. And then in the system of coordinates that we had been working for many years, we can't do that anymore. And it looked like yesterday, so the START treaty was extended, and now just we are moving into the summer of 2021. And so there is the intermediate elections in the United States of America, and the countdown of START has already started. And we need, without wasting time, with the maximum energy and dynamics, to concentrate on getting some kind of a modern, state-of-the-art configuration in the area of controlling the weapons, in the area of armaments control. It's not even the case that we need to find an answer whether we can reduce tension, but what the new equation of security and safety should be, and we need to formulate that. So I'm not going just to speak much longer on my introductory comment. I would like to give the floor to Thomas Graham, who for so many years has dedicated his efforts to Russia and working on the relations with Russia, highly esteemed and prominent, so senior partner of Kissinger. So since the floor is yours, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sergei. And it's a real pleasure to be here at the Primakov meetings. I think these are one of the most important set of international meetings on international affairs that we have, so it's a real pleasure to be here. In my brief opening remarks, I want to make 2 points about how the Biden administration looks at the world, and then 2 on the upcoming summit in Geneva on June 16th. First is the obvious point that for the Biden administration, China is clearly the top foreign policy priority. China is a strategic competitor which the United States has confronted never before in its history. It's a country that competes across all dimensions of power, economic, military, diplomatic, technological, and so forth, but is also a country with which the United States is inextricably intertwined economically. So this is an unprecedented challenge for the United States. And China, to my mind, is going to be the focus of the meetings that President Biden will have in his initial European tour at the G7 summit, the meeting with the EU leaders, and NATO. And China is likely to attract much more attention than Russia in those meetings. That despite the fact that clearly the president wants the support of his allies and partners in Europe and Japan and Asia, so he can present a united front when he deals with President Putin in Geneva. The second point that I want to make is that the Biden administration has parted from the Trump administration in its analysis of international affairs. It no longer really believes in great power competition. It doesn't see Russia as a strategic competitor, but if you look at its guidance and the speeches of the president himself and Secretary of State Antony Blinken, it sees Russia as a destabilizing force on the international stage. While there's much more conversation in Washington about the strategic alignment between Russia and China, that really is not a top concern of this administration. They still don't believe that that type of strategic alignment will be enduring. And therefore, they put Russia in a separate category. Now, the administration would have preferred to deal with Russia on a less active basis than they have over the past several months. Russia has a way of forcing itself onto the American agenda. It's a player that can't be ignored. And my guess is that the administration is going to find that it's going to have to engage with Russia much more actively, much more frequently than it had anticipated when it entered office just a few months ago. Now, with respect to the upcoming summit in Geneva, the Biden administration has made it quite clear that it's not seeking a reset in relations. It wants no escalation in relations. It talks about building a stable and predictable relationship with Russia. Now, it's not clear exactly what that means. I would argue that the relationship is predictably bad at this point, and it is a dangerous relationship. So I think the administration is speaking more in terms of building a stable, constructive, less dangerous relationship with Russia, one that removes us from the trajectory we're on now that is leading towards open conflict between our two countries. Now, if that is the goal for the administration, then I think it's imperative that the United States and Russia launch a sustained dialogue on the full range of issues on the U.S.-Russia agenda, not only the areas in which we can cooperate, but perhaps even more important, the areas in which we can continue to compete. It's not going to be possible for the administration to work solely from its agenda. It's going to have to work from the agenda that the Russians want as well. So it's going to have to be a combination of two things. And as I said, it has to be across the full range of issues. Strategic stability talks clearly are important. It's imperative that we discuss this issue in all seriousness, given the changes in the strategic environment over the past several years. But strategic stability talks themselves are not going to be sufficient to carry this relationship forward. In fact, if we're going to have progress in these talks, they really have to be embedded in a broader dialogue about U.S.-Russian relations. The way we dealt with this issue when President Nixon and Soviet leader Brezhnev were entertaining detente, when President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev were dealing with these issues. I don't think there's going to be a positive spillover impact from what we do in strategic stability on the rest of the agenda, but there is a soft linkage between talking about the full range of issues and the rapidity with which we can make progress on strategic stability talks. Finally, if we're thinking about the summit in terms of success, I would argue that success is marked not by agreements on the outstanding issues. Success is marked by an agreement on a framework for sustained dialogue over the next several years. And this has two aspects. The first is an agreement on the structure of relations, that is, the channels which we're going to use in order to conduct this dialogue. I think there needs to be a White House-Kremlin channel, one that is in place now but needs to be continued to set the broad strategic framework for the relationship. There needs to be a much more active channel between the State Department and the Russian Ministry of Affairs to work on implementation of whatever agreements are reached, also to negotiate and discuss the various differences in relations. And then I think there are a set of auxiliary channels, mill-to-mill special services to our intelligence service that can play an important role in structuring relations. I'm also a great advocate for expert dialogues, although I don't think that it's imperative now if the relationship between the two governments improve. Although I do think we ought to look at unofficial expert dialogues that deal not only bilaterally, but in trilateral formats, such as Russia, India, China, Russia, India, the United States, Russia, China, the United States, and so forth, as giving a further impulse to thinking about how our countries interact on the global stage. And finally, as part of this, we really do need to restore normal diplomatic relations. That is, our two ambassadors should return to their post in Washington and Moscow, and we really need to restaff our embassies to a level that's sufficient for carrying on a sustained dialogue. If we do those two things, then I think the summit will be a success. Let me stop there, Sergei.
Dr. Graham.
Dr. Graham, before I ask to take the mic, my old good friend and colleague Sergei Rogo, before I ask him to do that, I would like to appeal to all the panelists, to call on all panelists to discuss, to think, to argue on two topics that Thomas Graham identified very clearly, very graphically. So the perception of Russia as a destabilizing force, and then and as a result, so they do not perceive Russia as a partner with whom they can sustain dialogue along the lines of the former algorithms, and that Russia got into some kind of a new category from the viewpoint of the United States, which did not exist before, and this is absent vis-a-vis this new classification of Russia and putting it in the field of opponents. To what extent can we overcome this perception? Can we move forward? Does it open new opportunities from the viewpoint of improving our relations, and are there any chances to reduce tension and instability? Okay, I want you to think on that. Sergei Mikhailovich, I'm happy to see you. So you're in good shape and form. Over to you. Thank you, Sergei. For me, it's an honor to participate in regular Primakov readings. So they have very authoritative, and that has been laid down as a multilateral analysis of international relations. So I'd like to apologize for the way I look, because I was discharged from the hospital only yesterday. That's why I have no tie, because I'm not yet fully recovered. I'm not fully recovered. Now, just back to business. I think that it's for more than 7 years, Russia and the United States have been in the state of Cold War. Certainly, it's different from the former Cold War, from the first Cold War, but there are some common traits of this Cold War. Unfortunately, I don't see any prospects that this Cold War, this new Cold War, will stop anytime soon. Certainly, we cannot exclude that it may last for several more years or even decades, because it's a geopolitical competition, and it's not. But I talk about economic sanctions against Russia. I mean economic sanctions against Russia. And so then this egregious, flagrant propaganda that reached fantastic dimensions in recent years, and the negative image of Russia built in the United States, and negative image of the United States built in Russia, and I don't think they will disappear anytime soon. About the prospects of the summit, I think that so we can say with apprehensive hope that we will be able to reduce tension and stress and a stressful situation that exists, and first and foremost in the military sphere. And this is related to the fact that unfortunately we have gone down to the new arms race and started so that no holds barred, and so with the exception of START extension, and now unfortunately there's no ground for the normal diplomatic dialogue, and we effectively, even at the official level, we do not talk to each other. We barely talk to each other. But at the same time, the United States certainly do not want to allow for the formation of China-Russia union against the United States, because I think that this is the main reason why Biden decided to go for this summit with Putin. And why I'm talking about cautious optimism, because the Biden administration has restored this term, strategic stability. So the administration of Trump denied this term. And the notion of strategic stability means the necessity So I think that Americans agree to that. So it means that we need to discuss the issues of not only nuclear weapons, but even anti-missile defense, then high accuracy, high precision weapons, cyber weapons, and everything, space. So it's all part of this strategic stability notion. And I don't think that we can expect that at the summit they will have reached a breakthrough and conclude specific agreements on these issues. I doubt that, but still I think that the two presidents may agree on certain points, that to the fact that we need to start negotiations on a wide gamut of issues. I would like to touch upon several of them. First is the nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, I think that the United States will be trying to make sure that in the the U.S. and Russian agreement that will replace START 3, so they should put constraints not only on nuclear strategic ones, but on all, so to put limits on all strategic weapons, not only intercontinental, but in a medium range. So I think that we need to agree with this approach, although it's not comfortable for us. But without this, I don't think that we would have reached any agreements at all. Here we go into more detail. We can see that it's on these issues we can protect and promote our own security matters. Then another point, which is the medium-range missiles. And the United States continue at the official level, so they do not want to respond to the proposal of Putin on moratorium on the deployment of the new generation of medium-range missiles in Europe. And here, what amazes me, that even many experts, American experts and European experts, that's what amazes me. So they don't seem to understand the substance of Russian proposals concerning the readiness of our country to go for inspections, on-site inspections, if it's reciprocal. So they don't seem to be aware of that. So we're not talking about only offensive medium-range missiles, but even launch pads of Mk-41 of Aegis Ashore, and which is placed in Europe, deployed in Europe, where from which not only interceptor missiles, but even offensive missiles like Tomahawks could be launched from those pads. What concerns me, and in the American expert community, in the European American expert community, everyone is saying, so let's agree on non-deployment of nuclear medium-range missiles in Europe. And I think that this position reflects this absence of any understanding of our interests. Why should Russia agree to this proposal when Russia, unlike the United States, cannot deploy our medium-range missiles land-based near the boundaries of the United States, and the United States can do that in the Baltic states and Poland, so when they fly in time of several minutes, and to the strategic targets of Russia, including in Moscow. And that is why not only missile bases, but radio stations, then command points, etc. And I don't think that will go for similar terms and conditions, because that would create a situation whereby our early warning systems about missile attack would lose their efficiency. Because how can you possibly make a decision in 3 minutes of flying time, make a decision and assist a counter-strike, like the Russian doctrine says. And as a result, there may be a situation which will repeat, which is even more dangerous than the Cuban crisis, Caribbean crisis of 1962. And then I really wish that both the expert communities and the official public people of the Biden administration understood that Russia would not agree to things that go counter to our interests. Then the missiles of middle-range missiles in Asia. That's another challenge. And here I think that there's ground for talking, because in China they have a lot of missiles like that. In the United States will be definitely deploying in western part of the Pacific their missiles, and here so we have a possibility to start trilateral negotiations: Russia, China, and the U.S. And that is why. I think that India may join, may wish to join, so if China insists, and then Pakistan will follow suit, and this kind of process, I do not think it will lead to any legally binding agreements that would establish limits to the numbers, but certain rules of this competition will be stopped or identified. And in conclusion, I would like to say that it is true that everyone is making conjectures as to what this summit will look like. Someone likened it to the Vienna meeting in 1961, after which in certain time there was the Caribbean crisis. Someone likened it to Reykjavik. But I think that in all probability we may probably think about the possibility of moving towards 1972, that eventually led to the signing, not immediately, the signing of very important agreements on strategic offensive missiles and missile defense agreements that actually set the rules of sustainable competition. I think that this kind of rules could become the result of the upcoming negotiations between our diplomats, American diplomats, and the military experts, who I hope will start shortly after the summit, a few weeks later or a few months later. And then I would like, so there are many other things that I want to reason and argue, but I think that I have used my time and I will stop at that. Thank you. I would like to thank academician Rogov, but I would like to ask you, Sergei Mikhailovich, to answer. So I'm just abusing the authority of the moderator. I want you to answer now. I've been listening with great interest to your considerations as to what may become the substantive part of the negotiations between U.S. and Russia in the area of arms control. But how would you evaluate the chances for the ratification in the Senate of similar agreements? Do they stand a chance? What will be the political dynamics in the United States? How it may influence the prospects of keeping weapons control system in the classical sense, in which we have known it for many decades. Concerning the prospects of ratification in the Senate, it is true that that American political situation is unpredictable. But if Biden submits this agreement for the ratification that would provide for establishing limits for all nuclear weapons, including non-strategic, and that's exactly what the United States had been trying to achieve for longer than 20 years. So it could be considered as American victory of American diplomacy, and that could give us a good chance for the ratification of this new agreement that would replace START 3. So with regards of other topics like anti-missile defense, middle-range missiles, I do not see any prospects for the ratification of new legally binding documents of this kind at the American Senate. And besides the agreements, it's quite possible so we can have executive agreements that the administration may conclude and the president, which do not require ratification in the Senate. And at the same time, there may be some political agreements and the political commitments, parallel commitments, just like in 1991 it happened with the nuclear tactical weapons, and so that the set of instruments is not limited to the system of agreements that requires ratification, but how and which way the negotiations will proceed, very difficult to predict. So then the interim elections that will take place next year in the United States, if the Republicans so maintain their control over Congress, will certainly worsen the prospects of any ratification of any weapons control. In the circumstances, we need to consider only other options like executive agreements or parallel political commitments. Thank you. I'm sure we'll go back.
Thank you. I'm sure we shall go back, and it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Michael Kaufman, a very prominent researcher and editor and author of many publications, and a person who specializes in the most difficult problems, including those in the countries bordering Russia. So the floor is yours, Mr. Kaufman. We're happy to welcome you here at Primakov Readings, even virtually, remotely.
Thank you, Sergey, and thanks for the kind invitation to participate once again in Primakov Readings. I'll try to make my comments brief, especially since Tom Graham's already made brilliant remarks, as is my colleague Sergey. My personal expectations for the upcoming summit are actually low, but it is potentially the beginning of stabilization and what will remain fundamentally an adversarial relationship. I think first, there is a pessimistic outlook. Russia is not high on the priority list of the United States. That's not unusual, and it's not clear how much political capital will be spent on making this a more predictable relationship. Second, there's a question of whether we truly believe that de-escalation is possible without addressing some of the fundamental issues or disagreements in the bilateral relationship. The current belief in Washington is that not much can be done with Russia as it is, and therefore it is best to wait because compromises are not visible on the horizon, and they're not worth the expected or anticipated costs. Unfortunately, waiting means conducting the bilateral relationship in response to crises, which is partly what led to its degradation. And third, it's not clear that stabilization really means compartmentalization or steering the confrontation away from competing over vital interests. If this is not the case, then it's unlikely to succeed in the medium or long term. Now, we have some fundamental issues in terms of perceptions. Both countries perceive the other as being in decline and think that it may be easier to pursue their respective agenda at a later date. The United States sees Russia as a declining power, and Russia sees U.S. dominance in international affairs as on the wane, increasingly challenged by China. And both sides can interpret world politics through confirmation bias to validate those beliefs. There's evidence, they can see it to confirm their rationalizations. There are also contradictory imperatives for stabilization. On the one hand, we see continued crises and political instability in the former Soviet space. But on the other, the U.S. has increasingly made it clear that Europe is a secondary theater for American strategy. U.S. strategy will be focused around China. That is a secular trend. It is an enduring trend here to stay. China is seen as a pacing threat. Russia is seen as a country that is very assertive, but fundamentally more of a spoiler. Part of the reason for that is perceived Russian economic and political stagnation, plus lack of technological development and competitiveness. However, even as the United States now works to restore its alliances and relationships with European nations, American attention available to deal with European problems will continue to wane. U.S. attention will be increasingly pulled away to the Asia-Pacific region. Now, what can be achieved? So strategic stability talks, I think, are fundamentally important. These can include the anticipated set of issues like cyber warfare, political warfare, space, counter-space systems, issues deriving from military exercise and deployments in Europe, which we see an increasing trend of, and the implications that we see of new types of conventional or nuclear weapons. Obviously, these talks would be a very positive step, and they can build on working groups that were taking place last year. However, arms control may consume the bulk of the strategic stability agenda, because arms control is more concrete, it's more technical, and it's more practical. And even there, we have no reason to assume that arms control talks will prove successful, as you just asked Sergey about the likelihood of ratification in the Senate, right? And arms control is not synonymous with stabilization or necessarily strategic stability. In fact, the stability issues in the relationship don't really derive from problems in arms control. It may be a contributing factor, but that's not why we are here. So, in my view, there are probably 3 key steps that need to be taken. Tom, in some respects, has already stolen my thunder here, but I perhaps will elaborate on some of his comments from my perspective. First, to pursue the agenda, we definitely need to fix the problem of diplomatic contacts, embassy staff, and the basic ability to engage and conduct bilateral relations and negotiations. Second, we have to accept that coercion fundamentally has diminishing returns, and we have to expand the range of issues in which we are willing to pursue negotiated outcomes. Third, the relationship will require both sides to show a degree of restraint in how they engage in this confrontation. That restraint may have to be unilateral, and no, it may not be reciprocated, but such is the nature of things if countries are truly interested in expending political capital and in putting in the effort to achieve stabilization. Finally, political establishments, I think in both countries, have to recognize that nothing is going to get easier in the coming years. This adversarial relationship is here to stay. We agree on that, just as our respective opponents are. But we do have to take concrete steps to avoid some of the worst types of crises, the kind witnessed during the Cold War, and not to repeat those episodes or mistakes. Thank you. I'll conclude my remarks and turn it over back to you, and leave some time for my respected colleagues here on the panel.
Давайте поприветствуем господина Кофмана.
Let us welcome Mr. Kaufman and thank him for this very super sober, illusion-free, down-to-earth view on reality, how it is perceived from the position of a researcher who knows the subject very well and having deep knowledge in the intricacies of the modern international life, especially in the areas of geopolitical roles and changes in the forces on the international arena. I would like to support with both hands one of the ideas that you have just said, though I cannot agree with some of the starting points offered to us for discussion. I believe that Michael is absolutely right in saying that we need to try to expand the range of questions where both sides need to find some solutions, some ways out. This is a very difficult task, considering very low level of mutual trust and, in general, lack of skill to look for solutions over the last few years. But I see no other way out. Otherwise, we shall be just staying in this vicious circle, a close circle of mutual suspicions and incapacity and lack of capacity to offer a constructive alternative, at least, in fragmented areas by directions. But I still hope that we shall keep discussing those matters. Now I'm happy to pass the floor to Mr. Alexander Cooley, who heads Harrison Institute in Columbia University and is a professor of politology. And for many years he spent researching the subject of post-Soviet space. And the floor is yours, Professor. Welcome you at Primakov Reading.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I do have some slides. I have taken the mandate to be provocative, and so I would like to try and engage with some of the points that have been brought up today, as well as try and illustrate some of the difficulties involved. The title of my presentation is, Can We Talk About From Reset to Substantive Dialogue in U.S.-Russia Relations? Over the years, as I have worked at the Institute, where we run a number of exchanges and dialogues, including with my good friend, Professor Zboraleva, on the panel, this has become increasingly of interest to me. What should and shouldn't be in dialogue? How should we shape them? What should the agenda be for U.S.-Russia relations? All of these have been challenged by recent events. Let me just mention this important idea of stereotypes. I think they are pervasive on both sides. Michael, I think, put it very well. Both sides see the other in decline. The U.S. is a declining hegemon. The line in many DC circles that Russia is a declining power, sometimes referred to as a regional power, and sometimes the U.S. is referred to as trapped in the Cold War mindset. Of course, these are not helpful in our endeavors. I also want to address something that Tom Graham said about resets and how resets become sort of a fundamental forum for taking stock of where U.S.-Russia relations are. It's a very interesting academic discussion. What was the original reset in Malta in 1989? Perhaps because it was so consequential to ending the Cold War, we have tended to put a lot of faith in resets. And yet, resets repeatedly in the post-war. There are moments in which relations have been close and cooperative, and of course, after 9/11, with the attempted Obama reset, but relations always seem to unravel as a result. And the question is why? I think one clue is in how the Obama reset unraveled, right? I think the administration very correctly perceived that trust had broken down, and some sort of cooperation needed to be reestablished. There was an identification of so-called not easy areas, but manageable areas, and then using that kind of functional momentum to then move on to more quote-unquote difficult issues, missile defense, the Iranian nuclear deal, the post-Soviet states and NATO. But underlying this, I think, was a false and faulty assumption that if we engaged in this process, this bilateral process, that then Russia could come back into the international system as the United States understands it, as a quote-unquote responsible stakeholder, right? And I think this is an issue that on the American side, we haven't taken as seriously as we could. To me, the sort of three perhaps unsolvable, but certainly the big issues, the enduring sources of U.S.-Russian tension in the post-Cold War are the fate of the post-Soviet space, or the quote-unquote near and broad, right? Whether the post-Soviet states are free and sovereign to make their own foreign policy and security decisions. I would add that I agree that the past year we have seen instability in places like Kyrgyzstan and Belarus, the war, of course, in Nagorno-Karabakh, but we haven't seen the same level of U.S.-Russian tensions over both political protest and conflict the way we did in 2008 and 2014. And I think that's a good thing, with the partial exception of Belarus, of course. The second major issue is the role of democracy promotion, advocacy for liberal values, human rights. One side sees this as the avenue to open societies and assuring stability. The other side sees this in and of itself as a cause of instability and even failed states in some of the cases like the Arab Spring. The policy of so-called regime change under the guise of democracy promotion. Here we have another vector, I think, that we're going to see, which is the Biden anti-corruption agenda, and just how that is reconciled with promotion of human rights and democratization. These are heterogeneous types of liberal values, I think remains to be seen. And then third and foremost, we haven't gotten to grips that we have very different understandings of who makes the rules in world politics and in international order. A integrated system that is led by the U.S. And its allies, or a more multipolar, or to use the word, polycentric world. To me, these are the enduring sources of tension that are not addressed. Some other issues that we occasionally try and build a relationship, the economic relationship, as we know, trade is only $22 billion. China's rise, this has been noted in some ways as a possibility. I'm very skeptical. Fighting terrorism is difficult because we also have different understandings of what causes terrorism. And collective global problem solving, we're just not there yet. Indeed, our domestic politics aren't there yet. I want to make two further points here about where we are. One is the politics of the international pandemic have reinforced each other's perceptions, as Michael commented. Initially, it seemed that even the mishandling of the pandemic in the United States signaled the collapse of U.S. global leadership, its withdrawal from the WHO. But as we see from survey data out there, strategic competitors haven't come off well either, right? So as negative and no confidence in the ability of President Trump to handle the pandemic, it was very high, 83% from this chart in Pew Center. President Xi did not fare well either, and neither did President Putin. So it doesn't seem like any side has gotten an advantage over this pandemic politics. And indeed, as we've shifted to new metrics from controlling the pandemic to vaccinating people, the United States, I think in its credibility and authority, has steadily moved up, although that list, I think, is a very interesting one in terms of the vaccine metrics and who's vaccinated the most. But certainly, pandemic politics have supported both sides, I think, in their worldviews. The second issue I want to point out is domestic politics within the U.S. This is data from Gallup. U.S. public opinion about Russia now is at a post-Cold War low. It seems every year I say this, and every year the trend lines get worse. 77% of the American public have an unfavorable view of Russia. Just 22% have a favorable view. And one of the drivers here is a partisan shift that, especially amongst Democrats, that Democrats are more prone to naming Russia as the U.S.'s greatest enemy. 46% of Democrats do so now, just 14% of Republicans, 34% of independents. So we see a kind of a partisan shift, too, in terms of perceptions of Russia, though overall perceptions of Russia in the U.S. public are not good. Perhaps surprising to my American colleagues, this is not the case in Russia. In Russia, the very negative perceptions of the U.S., especially in the wake of Crimea and the Ukraine crisis and conflict, we've seen attitudes, positive and negative, converge on about 40% each, right? So there's more positive views on the Russian side of the United States than the other way around. So what do we do about all this? And these are my sort of final 4 slides here. One is we have to recognize these fundamentally divergent priorities. These issues are big, they're important, but we have to start acknowledging each other's positions on them. Resets, grand bargains fail not for lack of chemistry or personalization, but also because there are these insoluble issues in the background. Still, I'm hopeful pragmatic compartmentalization on issues such as Syria, perhaps, can be compartmentalized. My second point here is we have to distinguish between domestic interests versus domestic interference, right? Each side has a clear interest and desire to comment upon, judge, and yes, nudge the domestic politics of the other. I think this sort of pretense we have that there's an absolute red line against commenting on each other's internal affairs. Powers with global reach do this all the time, right? The question is, can we distinguish between domestic interest and domestic actual acts of interference? And this is, I think, explains the shift certainly in democratic points of view and current U.S. public concerns about Russian cyber threats. And I think more importantly, can we still conduct a transnational contest of values across places like Europe or different continents, but still recognize what is in our bilateral interests, right? I think also key. So what should we talk about then? I think my own personal belief, and I'm not speaking on behalf of my government or my university, is that we should talk about difficult issues. We should not avoid talking about difficult issues, because when we just set those aside and we sort of take on what we think might be manageable, I think that these background issues just simmer, and I think they get more acute. So some of the possible things, again, just to be provocative, I would like to see a dialogue on mutual domestic political interference, both cyber and finance, where we discuss red lines. I'd like to see a dialogue on who is a foreign agent in each country, what are the designations and why does it matter. I would like to see a dialogue if liberal values, universal liberal values, should not underlie the international order, what should? And how would this be structured? And then finally, I would actually like to see a Russia-U.S. dialogue on China, not with the purpose of somehow prying Russia away from China, but actually informing the U.S. expert community more on what that relationship is like, how Moscow perceives Beijing, and what Chinese activities, how they are developing in third areas, Central Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America. Very finally, this is a biased question, but I put there, does the Academy have a role? I hope so, and I passionately believe so. For me, at a regional study center, this is not just about a multidisciplinary approach to understanding Russia, it's also examining our own politics of knowledge, our own assumptions and professional practices for how we deal with Russia. Many of these issues are cyclical, stereotypical enemy images, domestic political constraints, the filter of media coverage, the rough and tumble presidential politics. But I think the good news on our side is that the students are more knowledgeable about the region than ever before. They have more understanding. They have more empathy. And so I think we can engage in quite substantive exchanges and dialogues, but we have to get them visas. So this is a plea to both sides. Please, let's get the embassy situation, the consular services sorted out, and let's try and have meaningful exchanges and dialogues. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much, Professor Cooley, for the perspective and outlook that you proffered in delivering this material, and higher empathy in approaches than most of the bureaucrats who are supposed by the nature of their job description to take care of this area. And one of the ideas that you offered actually requires a follow-up from me. We cannot even raise higher than the perception of relations of Russia and the US as an object of, putting in efforts, and Russia per se. Here, a fundamental difficulty may be contained in managing our relation, because I think that my country will never agree to being perceived as an object of, applying some forces. And the agreements may only be achieved in a true search of a balance of common interest, which presents a huge problem. I agree with you in putting it that way, that the times of resets and reloads are in the past. I don't believe in no resets in the future, and it's better not to delve into this type of terminology, but try to find specific activities and the theory of little steps, which will grow higher trust to each other and probably start changes for the better in perceiving Russia in the US and the US in Russia that you so well demonstrated in your slides. And convincingly told us about it. Thank you so much. Professor Zhuravlyova, head of the chair, a well-known Americanist, and Victoria, I'm happy to pass the floor to you on the matters that you believe are necessary to cover and mention, and I hope that you will probably follow up on what the previous presenters said.
Let me start by I'm not Victoria Ivановna Zhuravlyova, and we kind of intersect with her all the time, and been intersecting, and then so just I'm filling in for her. I'm Center of International Relations and North American Studies. Okay, now just we got it right. Yes. Okay. We kind of very nicely, smoothly, owing to Professor Cooley, to the subject, arrived at the subject that I wanted to talk about and look at it from the same angle to U.S.-Russia relations. And remember an assumption, a thesis that Professor Graham started, that strategic stability is good and this is important, but it's not sufficient. And I remember that. Good for building good relations. Effectively, I get the impression that everything that we are talking about and where we are now, it's not relations, it's interaction. And the essence of Russia-American conflict is something that there is no relationship. It's about interaction of the states, about the conflict, the interaction of the state, about the competitive interaction between the states. It's not about relations, because the relations always require human dimension, and which, in my view, is absent completely in Russia-American relations right now. And effectively, if we can imagine graphically Russia-American interaction, it looks like something appended pyramid, and so the basis that should be actually wide and stable. Instead of it, it's sitting. It's a so small, and then at the bottom of it there is a human being, and it's not there. This human being is not there, and the top is what the essence of interaction is, and this is the conflict, the wide foundation on top, especially in the last decade, in the last many decades already, not only the conflict that we are witnessing right now. And today, so the peak of this opposition led to the fact that we are watching this dehumanization of Russia-American relations, and this dehumanization, which consists in the following: that we have stopped to see each other as human beings, because Americans are no longer humans, and Russians for Americans are no longer humans. They represent a state, and your state is in opposition to the other state. That's it. And to imagine, to portray them in human shape and form is getting more and more difficult, progressively difficult. So even the metrics tells about it very graphically. and very, very popular for the Russia-American interaction is the subject matter of enemy number one for Americans in the last 30 years of this continued acute phase of conflict is Russia. So Russia is even on the top of the lines, even ahead of China, above Iran, above North Korea. Only 3% Americans look at Russia negatively, and in the same thing is in Russia. So then America is top line, so even above Ukraine. So top number one. So but the numbers a little bit different, but the essence is the same. An average Russian perceive America as the main enemy of Russia and the main enemy of the state. And this is the essence of the conflict. We perceive each other through the states. So there is no human dimension there. And we perceive each other as the states. And without the human relations, so the relations are unstable, and that is why so we kind of fall into the conflict. Acute, not so acute, but we are always in conflict, and it's a kind of a smoldering conflict. It's always there because there is no human dimension, because there is nothing that could keep these relations buoyant, afloat. And the most horrible thing is that this state level as the basis, on top of it, it kills even the possibility of interacting at the level of human beings, especially during the acute phase of the crisis, when there is absolutely no interaction, no communication at the human level that we had before the conflict at the expert level, at the expert communities level, and it's not there, and it's not even so visa issues, impossible to get the visa, and it's a negative attitude on the part of both states and the political elite, so they are intent for these conflicts to develop. And even in the Soviet times, so there was scientific context, IRIX, they don't exist anymore. Even in the Soviet times, they existed, and in America they do, in Russia they don't. And that is why all expert contacts that are developing, have been developing the last 7 years, it's mostly owing to the enthusiasm and effort of specific institutes and specific human beings, and that's only what makes it possible. And then another the thing that gives us some hope is the availability of another level of interaction besides human being and the state, is the business level. In spite of the fact that all recognize that there is no economic relationship, business relationship between the U.S. and Russia, and the economies of Russia and the United States, they're not intertwined at all. But at the minimal level, so it's there. So there is some business at the minimal level. Moreover, during the years of crisis, it has not gone away. You will look at our mutual turnover between the U.S. and Russia. Then you will see that there practically has been no reduction of the turnover in the last 7 years. Moreover, the most recent figures, there was only one down spike during the pandemic for obvious reasons. There was some down spike, But the result of this first half year of this year is heralded the growth of our business between the United States and Russia by 15%. Even the passenger flow, even the passenger exchange, certainly it's minimal if you compare it to other countries, but it's stable between the U.S. and Russia, and this continuity, this stability gives us some hope that more than 400,000 people, so one way and the other way, so we have this area. There was just small reduction during the pandemic because of the inability to travel. So 400,000 people travel between the U.S. And Russia. This is mostly can be chalked down to business contacts. And if we look at He will look at the most recent forum that took place in St. Petersburg. So then more than about 500 companies were represented by the United States. According to the Chamber of Commerce of Russia, more than 1,000 companies with American financing still this very time exist, and they perform in Russia. They do business in Russia. And this is certainly it's a minimum compared to other countries when the direct investments, FDIs, which is only 0.1% of total investments, but still they're still there, and they are at a high level for present-day American-U.S. Russia-U.S. relations. And that gives us some hope and capability and ability that we may resume it, we may rebuild it, we may revive it. We rebuild the relations between us as humans. And what's important is to bring on the agenda this interaction of the states. And so we need to expand, to give this expanded agenda a relationship between the people, supporting business contacts, expanding business contacts, expanding human contacts, expert contacts, cultural connections. We need to work on that. About the future agenda, there are many subjects that where the United States may find a common interest and get to a new level of cooperation. So one of the topics could be ecology and environment issues. Maybe one of the that could be two cases in point. And so though it sounds strange, but Russia and the U.S. may be even more closer partners than Russia and the EU, because our common understanding of what is ecological challenge is and how to treat it, how to perceive it. For example, so Washington so the United States, just like Russia, they have a more pragmatic approach to the full replacement of hydrocarbons with the green technologies, and against the background of global warming, because global warming and the causes of the global warming are not positioned the same way as in the EU, perceived not in the same way. And so what causes it? Yeah. And so that could be a good subject for the dialogue between the U.S. and Russia. And then another topic that can be of importance. This is nuclear energy. In spite of the fact that the U.S. and Russia compete in this area, but it is exactly in this area where there is room for dialogue and there is room for interaction, both for business purposes and scientific purposes, all three, and the state purposes. All three levels may be in demand. And we need to restore our expert cooperation in the sphere of peace atom, so that was suspended and blocked during the conflict, and this is something that can give us a good new level of cooperation, non-state cooperation. And that is why my view is, in order for the relations become really relations and communications, so we need to change this, the essence of this interaction. So we need the states to create conditions for the human level and business level interactions. That's exactly what we need. Both Russia needs it and the US needs it. Thank you. I come around to your way of thinking. I suggest that when you said that in our relations, so there was a great deal of dehumanization component, dehumanizing. If the governments and the official circles could find a way to support the areas of the dialogue and possible cooperation that you spoke about, but not only that. And generally creates some conditions to normalize contacts. And here, what comes to the fore is the continuous problem of failure to provide visas. And so we'll continue to work. So then the refusal to produce visas, and so we've been talking about that. And so the former administration and the present administration do something useful in this area. So if not restore fully the work of so that people could visit each other and organize events, but at least not to reduce the existing contacts, minute, minuscule contacts. They're still there in this area, but there is still no response so far. But I think that we need to understand that we need to start with this, to start issuing visas. And I agree that the climatic agenda should come to the fore, and the participation of our president in the climatic virtual summit, and it would be so. It was very well demonstrated, and it conveyed this. We conveyed this idea to the international community, the level of responsibility that we attach to this idea, and that is why the United States we need to deal with to continue working in this area of the United States that claims to be the leader in this area. And thank you for reminding us about some basic moments. Now, just like this, to give the floor to a famous state politician, a person who we have seen in different combinations on different sites. So then Euro Commissioner, Minister, Deputy, the author of wonderful publications, Minister Frattini, the word is to you. But in one phrase, in one sentence, do you think there is a chance to reduce tension between Moscow and Washington? In one phrase, as an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Minister. It is a great pleasure for me to be invited to participate in this very interesting panel in the International Forum Primakov. And I will never forget my last bilateral meeting, my last visit to President Primakov a couple of years before he died in Moscow. My first phrase is yes. I think there is room to think and to work in order to make it possible not only to restore, but also to make stable and predictable good relationship between the United States and Russia. Much has been said. I will try to contribute to this very interesting panel by offering to you some ideas on how the topic, relations between US and Russia, is seen by Europe, European Union, and from a country, my country, Italy, that has been always playing a bridging role between the West and the Russian Federation. I myself have seen the fluctuations in the relations between the West and Russia. I was present. It was an emotion I will never forget at the signature of the NATO-Russia Council at Pratica di Mare between President Putin and President Bush. It was not a century ago. It was just in 2002. I was, as Vice President of the European Commission, signing framework agreements between Russia and European Union on security, on fighting drugs, on even immigration, on visa facilitation regime, all sensitive issues where Europe as a whole and Russia were in agreement. I saw also the difficult times during the crisis in Georgia, where exactly because we have been playing a bridging role, Italy decided to put a veto on the proposal of President Bush to put Russia out of G8, because we said, how is possible to try to normalize the situation in Caucasus without having Russia around the table, not outside the table? Unfortunately, later in the years, it didn't happen during the crisis of Ukraine. So I saw the fluctuations. How is the situation in Europe now? My first remark, and there are very important American experts that know of first-hand situation in US. Now, Europe is more important than ever for the new American administration. This is demonstrated. It is absolutely true. The priority number one is China, because China is considered the first international problem for America. But in order to be stronger, President Biden has absolutely to find a common position with European Union as a whole. This is demonstrated by the grand tour President Biden is preparing to be in Europe, to meet European member states, to meet NATO, to talk about all what can unite European partners around a common project. So, why so? Because President Biden knows, he realizes very well what is the truth. Europe is changing. Europe has been changing in its attitude to simply follow the guidance of the American ally, as it was during the second term of President Obama, when Europe, unfortunately, with my regret, critically followed the sanctions-based policy imposed by the United States after the Ukraine crisis. Now, in the European Union, the situation is getting different. You know very well how was the position recently expressed by some of the leaders of Europe, particularly France, the idea of strategic autonomy, which doesn't mean to, I would say, criticize NATO, but it means to strengthen autonomous capacity of European Union to be a player, together with the United States, of course, but not critically obeying to all the indications of America. The same applies to Germany, the second important European partner. You know very well what happens with Nord Stream pipeline. Nord Stream 2, when it came to happen, the criticism of America, Chancellor Merkel said, okay, dear American friends, be quiet. This is a question of national priority number one for Germany. It is a problem of energy security. And the same is for my country. In my country, we have been always criticizing the simple extensions 6 months after 6 months of the sanctions. We have been advocating for a political debate to talk about the political meaning of the sanctions that I would say resulted in zero for Europe. And of course, Russia was able to overcome some of the impact of the sanction. So in short, exactly because I would mention Spain, I would mention Portugal, I would mention Greece and others, there is no unity about escalation plan concerning relations with Russia. This is the reason why President Biden is trying to get European member states united around a concept, the concept of democracy and fundamental rights. because he knows very well that apart this emotional mentioning of a denominator, the League of Democracy, something like that, he will be very hardly keep united Europe concerning different interests that we are no longer incapable to show and to defend. Just to make an example for my country has as a first priority in the neighborhood stability of Libya and stability of Mediterranean. How is it possible to deal with stabilization of Libya without having a strategic relationship with Russia that plays a role, we like or not? I think it is a stabilizing factor in the east of Libya, while Turkey plays a role in the west of Libya. So it's absolutely necessary, if you want to stabilize Libya, to have a normal and strategic relation. And Italy will never give up its strategic interest to stabilize the northern of Africa, and to do this, to cooperate and to be in touch, in close touch with Russian Federation. The same applies to the Middle East. In Middle East, we know perfectly that the position of America was a progressive disengagement. In that progressive disengagement, second term of Obama administration and then President Trump left the Middle East with a relevant position of Russia, particularly in Syria, in the relationship with Egypt, which is a functional to stabilize the northern of Africa. How is it possible to think about dealing with Iran without having a clear strategic relationship with the Russian Federation that plays a key role in Syria and was able to play a role even in difficult moments of relations with the Turkish government? So just to give you some examples on why my deep conviction is that restoring a stable, predictable, good relationship, it is not a gift to President Putin. It is equally in the interest of America and the West as a whole, because in a world which is becoming more complicated, what kind of interest do we have in Europe to leave regions of the world in the instability situation? Think about Afghanistan. Yesterday, we pull out the Italian flag from Iraq, and the Italian troop will be leaving in few days forever Afghanistan. Was it an event strengthening the stability and the security? In my view, not at all. We accept it because it happened in the framework of NATO and Euro-Atlantic strategic relation. But how is possible to think there will be no repercussions because Taliban will rapidly try to reoccupy the whole of Afghanistan and impact on security of Central Asia? Central Asia represents a key interest for Russian Federation as well as for Europe. So many in common interests are there, and this is why President Biden administration is realizing, in my view, that if they want really to focus on the expansion and the assertive behavior of the China, which is a matter of fact, also by increasing military presence in Asia, increasing military funding in the budget, they have to avoid to push Russia in the hands of China, which is not good for Russia, in my personal opinion, but is not good at all for Europe, for America, and for the West as a whole. Do we have an interest to put Russia obliged to keep even more stronger relationship with China? It is not an interest at all. So, President, the precondition to succeed in Geneva, I agree completely with Professor Graham, a success could be represented by not signing agreement, which is unthinkable, but just to put a framework of, I would say, a way of cooperating, including, if you allow me, to agree to disagree on some specific issues. That could be an element of the framework. But the framework means, from now on, we restore a normal way, diplomatic relations, exchanges, confidential or not confidential exchanges, to try to normalize and to have a stability in our relations. My conclusion is that to achieve such as success, such as goal, we need at least three preconditions. This is my conclusion. The precondition, as our moderator said at the very beginning, is to overcome mutual mistrust. The perception of Russia as destabilizing country is coming from a mutual mistrust and creating a vicious circle, because it is absolutely clear that when one considers Russia by public statement as a destabilizing country, how is possible to think about a positive reaction from Moscow? So mutual distrust is undermining any kind of attempts to put on the table a stable framework to de-escalate. This is the first precondition. How to overcome? How to overcome? By explaining to the American administration, and we in Europe can do more, because for the reasons I try to explain, for America's Biden, Europe matters, and matters a lot. If they want to have, for example, a common position on China, you know very well that even on China, some of the European member states are doing something that America doesn't like at all, concerning 5G, concerning Huawei. So America has a strong and deep interest to get Europe united to, I would say, find a common position vis-a-vis, in this case, China. So it is a political trade-off. You help us to get united on China, which is our priority number one, and America realizes that since we Europeans are the neighbors of Russia, you have to listen to us. And if you listen to us, you have to make a distinction between the irrational, although historically explained, hawkish positions of some of our members, in particular some Baltic and Eastern members of EU, and the, I would say, big partners, Germany, France, Italy after the Brexit. These are the three countries that can play a role, especially under the leadership in Italy of President Mario Draghi. This has been tremendously increased, with the cooperation with other medium-level European countries, as I mentioned, like Spain or Greece or others. So if they will be listened to those countries that can have a role, they will realize that what unites us is much more than what divides Russia, the West, from and United States. The condition, the last condition, the condition number 3 is the result of all what I'm talking about. We need leadership. Without a clear leadership, you have been talking about the position before the American Senate, before the American conservative, hawkish positions. If you show leadership, all these problems will be overcome. Otherwise, you simply follow the politically correct, you follow the events instead of making a plan and putting on the table a vision. I think President Putin has shown to be a leader, to be a true leader. I'm sure, knowing him personally, since he was the vice president of President Obama, I know very well also President Putin, also President Biden should be put in the condition to play his leadership, to understand that it would be an added value for America, and on this, he will be achieving this comprehensive framework for security and stability that will be done not for the good of America, not for the good of Europe, but for the good of the world as a whole. This is not just my optimism, but I think realistically, the leaders understand at a certain moment what is their interest. What is the interest of America? Keep Europe divided? Keep Europe divided from the rest of the world? Not at all. Keeping Europe united. We in America will be united, sure, but Europe can play a bridging role that America can't in this moment. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое, министр Фратини, за...
Thank you very much, Minister Fratini, for sharing your experience as a politician and geopolitician. I think we are all familiar and grateful to you. We appreciate your firmness of your opinion and views and for drawing attention to some blocks of questions that have not been touched upon in the previous discussion, which is very important. And drawing the line after the first round, before proceeding to further discussions, I suggest that the audience asks panelists questions, if any. So please introduce yourself. Thank you very much. First, I want to thank the panelists for very sincere and frank and wonderful speeches, and the organizers for a perfectly arranged conference. Nadezhda Vasilevna Kapanenko from the Institute of Problems of Science Development of Russian Academy of Sciences. My question is as follows. Over the last few months, we heard the global agenda of the new Trump administration, with the key positions being climate change and technologies, AI primarily, and efficiently this organization of expert community and the stakeholders around this agenda. Probably a month ago, so there was a first summit of Nobel Prize winners arranged by the Academy of Sciences, and there's already a letter to the General Secretary, along with the main questions on climate change and AI. Now, there are discussions about setting up an international agency like the International Atomic Agency on developing, regulating artificial intellect. So Americans say, in spite of so this atomic agency was created was created during the Cold War, and even Russia and China can now be participating in such an agency. So is there a vision in Russia? What role Russia can play in those two, I believe, key parts of the global agenda? And my second question is, how would this new global element of agenda dovetail with the new policy that now Russia pursues? Thank you very much. But this is a question to panelists from Russia. Are you ready? Sergei Mikhailovich. So let us start with you, Victoria. Thank you for the question. But in fact, I believe that this is exactly the subject that may be very relevant for improving Russian-American dialogue. And these are not just relevant, but they're absolutely practical and possible to develop because they're in focus of both the Biden administration and the Russian administration and the Russian political establishment. So I believe that here there is room for interaction. And Russia, just like the United States, positions itself as the possible leader in the future. And there is understanding that in order to respond to those challenges, we need interaction, we need collaboration. Both in Russia and the US understand, and it's important. It's a very important factor for the future of our relations. Sergei Mikhailovich. The scientific potential of Russia is huge. We could contribute greatly in addressing those items of the agenda, and where the Americans and Europeans and Chinese have common interests. And for this to happen, it is necessary to overcome this mistrust and alienation wall that prevents scientific interaction. We need to change our state policies to science. Unfortunately, in Russia, it's under-financed. The scientific complex of Russia, the Russian Academy of Sciences, is under-financed, and so it's impossible to carry out the existing potential in this situation. Yes, there are achievements in certain areas, but on the whole, it is paramount to develop Russian science as a priority of our state policy, and not in words, but in actions. And then I believe the interaction with the US and other partners in the global domain will turn out quite successful. A couple of words from the moderator. As for the climate, here we have this, the benchmark are clear, and the conference in Glasgow, and working on national obligations. We are ready that we are happy that the U.S. came back to the Paris Accord on climate. We have our obligations. As for AI, so this domain is broken down into several sites, and we discuss along the UNESCO lines in the Council of Europe, and serious discussions and up to developing a convention regulating application of AI and AI technologies, and there are efforts in this area along the line of European Union. I will not comment because we have many things carried out there. And there is military application of AI, and mainly considered through profile working group on within the Convention of Arms, and there are 11 recommendations developed. As for the agency like International Atomic Agency, it requires further study, but I can foresee difficulties in mandate, because once we start talking on a sovereign level, it's not just a multi-stakeholder approach if we use the buzzwords, but it is all a thing of the future, and Russian-American dialogue will help. It depends on the Russian-American dialogue. Yes, floor is yours. Good afternoon. So I'm from the Moscow State University. Thank you for the interesting discussion and the opportunity to ask a question. I would like to ask you, dear Sergei Alexeyevich, and if you allow me, Thomas Graham. In one of his interviews, Sergei Lavrov actually complained about the deficit of mutual respect between Russia and the US, and actually expressed his belief that the relations can be just like the same as during the Cold War, or even worse. When we go back to the world picture during the Cold War, well, what can be worse, you think, In your view, in your opinion, do you think the relations can get even worse than the Cold War status? And what will it mean for the US and the Russian Federation and for the rest of the world? Thank you for the question. Tom?
Thank you very much for that question. I think we all hope that the relationship between our two countries will not get worse than it was in the darkest days of the Cold War. But I think it's also true that the state of relations today does begin to approach those relationships. Now, can it get worse? And what would that look like? Sergei Rogov pointed out the problems in the nuclear sphere. If we don't come to some common understanding of how to manage strategic stability in the current period, a much more complicated strategic landscape than we had during the Cold War, we do run the increased risk of a confrontation between the United States and Russia that escalates to the nuclear level. That is certainly something that would be worse than what we had during the Cold War. I think the relation becomes more difficult to manage now, in part because it is no longer a bipolar relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. It is polycentric, multipolar, or at least there are very many different centers of power and influence in the world today. And the central axis of global affairs is no longer the Russian-American relationship. And what that means is that certainly in Washington, I think as Michael Kaufman pointed out quite well, Russia is not a priority. Europe is a secondary theater for American strategic interest at this point. And the amount of time and attention that Washington will be prepared to devote to the relationship with Russia is significantly less than it was during the Cold War. That, I think, this lack of contact, lack of active interaction raises the possibility of misperceptions, misunderstandings of what the red lines of each side are, and therefore increases the possibility that may inadvertently overstep those red lines, again in ways that leads to a level of conflict that perhaps we didn't see during the Cold War. In fact, because then both sides understood the responsibility that we bore for maintaining strategic stability and peace in the world, and also the catastrophe that would result if we didn't manage our relations responsibly.
I think that many things that Professor Graham said actually coincides, matches our opinion of the situation. People who soberly estimate the opportunities for the relations with the US and actually learned the lessons from the past. And I admit there may be worsening of the relations, but we shall do everything in our power to avoid that, because the risks are very serious and crisis management is still on the agenda. And that's why we are closely attending to the topics of preventing hazardous incidents and hazardous military activity. And recently in Moscow, we had the round of survey of the agreement of 1972, bilateral agreement concluded in those times by our predecessors, as they clearly realized why it was necessary, what to do with it. We want a refreshment of this tool. We want to upgrade this tool. We want to renew it. And speaking about the new security equation, we certainly account for new technological factors that panelists mentioned very convincingly and reminding us that they need to be addressed. And we have created an impressive thematic agenda with the US, and we shall be working on it. And it's important for us to be heard, because there are problems with being heard. Probably they have to do with the differences in priorities. Tom has just told us, and many said that that the focus of attention is on China, and Europe is the second priority, and the Russian place is not yet identified, but the resources will not be sent in bulk to Russia.
But we do have some priorities certainly that the United States is not the final power in the world, and we'll try just to reduce the confrontation level, and we hope that there will be a movement towards us. I'm sorry that I have to stop our discussion, hoping that we'll continue this discussion in this or that form later. I'd like to thank you for the session, our panelists, and special thanks to the audience, and special thanks to all our foreign contributors and interlocutors, and I'm sorry that some of you have not gotten a chance to ask a question. Thank you.